So our final panel of the day has two moderators, Russ Johnson and Ken Kramer, and three panel members, Lyle Larson, Doug Miller, and Tracy King, all representatives in the Texas House of Representatives, and all on the House Natural Resources Committee. And so, Russ, you and Ken, take it away.
Thank you, Todd. So here's the plan. I'm going to introduce these three gentlemen, and then Ken and I are going to ask them some questions. And of course, the theme is where do we go from here? But when I introduce them, I want you to understand that each one of these three gentlemen had an integral role in the Edwards Aquifer dispute that you've been hearing about both this morning and this afternoon. First, to my furthest right is Representative Tracy King. Representative King represents District 80 in the western part of the Edwards region, and did in 1993, if I'm not mistaken. Tracy, is that right?
No, in 1995.
95. So he's been involved in the Edwards dispute since the early days of the 90s, and has represented the western communities, the agricultural communities, since then in all of the issues that relate to the development of the Edwards Aquifer. In the middle is Representative Doug Miller, representing District 73. As Todd mentioned, all three of these gentlemen serve on the House Natural Resource Committee, so any water legislation, any Edwards legislation will come through their committee. But in 1993, again, if I'm not mistaken, Doug, you were the mayor of the city of New Braunfels, or you were the president of the Chamber of Commerce, one or the other. I certainly remember that you were in the room throughout the process of the negotiations that led to Senate Bill 1477, and then went on to serve, after serving as mayor of the city of New Braunfels, as a member of the Edwards Aquifer Authority Board, and then as its chairman. After, I think you were the second chairman after Mike Belden. So talk about a history of involvement in the Edwards Aquifer issues. Doug certainly qualifies in that regard. And then finally, Representative Lyle Larson. Lyle and I go way back. We're both from San Antonio, representing District 122, the Honorable Frank Court's previous district in northern San Antonio. But again, to put it in perspective, Representative Larson was, again, if I'm not mistaken, on the City Council of the City of San Antonio in the early 90s. When this dispute arose, and was one of those folks that was adamant that we as a city should not be held ransom by the Endangered Species Act and its application to our historic water use. So each of these three gentlemen has a long history with the Edwards Aquifer Authority and the Edwards disputes, and has continued to be involved in those issues in their current position. So with that, Ken, fire away with your first salvo.
Well, first of all, I should preface this by saying I think one of the interesting things is that so many of us who were involved in the Edwards dispute in one respect or another 20, 25 years ago are still actively involved in water policy one way or the other at this point. Some of you in the room may think that's a good thing. Some of you in the room may think that's a not so great thing, but we're still here. We talked a lot during the day today about the Edwards dispute and the resolution, if you will, coming out of the litigation and related activities. I'm interested in hearing from each one of you as to how you think the litigation and other activities involved in the Edwards dispute have affected the way in which your community or your part of the state deals with water problems today, either positively or negatively or both. And I'm going to start with Lyle, who is closest to me. In terms of how San Antonio approaches water issues today, what have been the positive or negative effects or both of the Edwards dispute and all the activity in the 90s and early?
Well, it's interesting, the contrast of the three of us up here. I was right in the middle between the downstream users, and then Tracy was representing the ag on the western end of it, and we were pitted right in the middle of it from the city, and trying to figure out exactly which way we break. Senator Armbruster, he took a pretty strong position on the downstream users and preserving the aquifer, and so it was a very adversarial for a long time. And I know that Weir Labatt talked earlier today. He probably gave you his perspective from the city's standpoint. It's really pushed San Antonio to be probably the most innovative community in the state as far as bringing new water to bear. And my hat's off to Robert Puente and the leadership he's provided to Saul's, not only going out and working with the folks out in the western part of the Edwards and securing water resources, being innovative as far as setting up a process so we can get more pivot irrigation systems in Uvalde, and the value of that water coming back to San Antonio that they're not using. And they're putting their dollars out to make that happen. And then going out and finding sources of water outside of the region, going into Simsboro Aquifer, up in Lee County, Lee and Caldwell County. Somebody had to do it. Somebody's got to start bringing water from somewhere, and then the diversification of their portfolio, bringing in desalination, having the process in place to build the largest inland desal plant in the world within the next 10 years, and then storing water underground. I think all of those things probably wouldn't have taken place if he wouldn't have had the pressure on the Edwards, and San Antonio had to react. And they have, indisputable, they have the best reputation as far as conservation, as large as the large communities in the state of Texas and throughout the southwestern part of the United States. So I think that a lot of times scarcity drives policy, and those policies will bring water, or they'll conserve more water, and I think San Antonio exemplifies that as well as any community in the southwestern part of the United States.
Doug?
Okay, thanks, Ken. Let me first say it's a pleasure to be here with you today. This is really a couple of historic things that happened today. We've got a brand new governor, a lieutenant governor up in the state capitol. First time that's happened in 15 years, and then this panel, I look around the room and I see so many friends like the Specks and others, Mary Kelly, and a lot of people that I've had, Glenn and so on, that I've had the opportunity to work with and learn from over the years. And so I appreciate all of their input and the opportunity to record this history, because this has been, as my daughter says, it is a journey. It's not really a destination, it's a journey. So thank you. Talking about going forward, and some of the things, Ken, that you've asked about, and just making some quick notes on this, is I think that the communities I serve, we're Comal County, and about half of Comal County, that portion that was in the Edwards, and about half of Guadalupe County. And the reason Guadalupe County is because they were already using Edwards, and the way that 1477 was designed is it was a no transport. In fact, it's the only no transport district to my knowledge in the state. And so a lot of proactive measures. I'm talking about finding, as Lila said, alternative sources, really forcing us, because we really did have an area, San Marcos included, that we were totally dependent upon groundwater, and that was it. And I think John and other people that were on the either city council or chamber of commerce, I remember, about the time that this legislation was gearing up, we made a trip downstream. You remember that, John? And we went down because the folks in Cuero, Gonzales, all the way to Port Lavaca. We ended up in Port Lavaca. They had little or no recognition of the relationship, even though GBRA was trying to tell the story with the springs and what happened to them, even down in the bays and estuaries. Some of the things that Russ said is my involvement in water has continued. I did have the pleasure for about 10 years serving on the Region L Water Planning Committee, and I'm on the Environmental Flows Committee, and which, you know, we really pay attention to what's happening in the bays and estuaries and going downstream, and so I really think that a lot of communities have woken up because of these lawsuits and the things that happen. I think we have much more conservation. Mike Belden, who I learned a lot from as a chairman, and I was so honored to follow him as a second chairman, you know, said that we probably, San Antonio, all of us in this area, ought to stay in phase 1 conservation year-round, because, you know, we do live. Sometimes we get to thinking, we see that carpet grass out there and other things and the lush green, and we think that still people have the idea that water's, you know, readily available and fairly cheap. And for the most part it was. And so it was changing a mindset, I think, of people. And those lawsuits, as they've come along, I had the pleasure of listening to Stuart, and I remember meetings in Stuart's offices. And but the fact was that we had to change a mindset, and Judge Bunton, you know, took that to heart, and really it was more about developing those alternatives. Quick, you know, lawsuits that you talked about. You know, I heard the last panel talk about the voting rights lawsuit. You know, we're back in that again. I thought we had that all settled. You know, when I think it was HB 3259 or something, Tracy's first session, where I thought we fixed all that stuff. You know, and with the agreement of a lot of folks around the table. So I learned a lot about voting rights. Learned in the bar shop case. You know, learned a lot about district judges and how they typically rule in favor of their constituents that elect them. Then in the day case, I just left Chief Justice Heck at lunch, you know, in that case to come out. I mean, that was mine. I was chairman of the board when that lawsuit started. So it's been an interesting journey to go through all this, and I have learned a lot about Russ Johnson and a lot of guys that practice water law.
Okay, I think we'll leave it at that. Tracy, what about in your district, in your area of the state? How's what has happened in the Edwards affected water decisions out in your part of the state, either positively or negatively?
Thank you, Ken. I was very involved in the discussions in 1993, and then in 1995 I was in the legislature when they had to redo the board because of the voting rights lawsuit at that time, or the failure to get approval or whatever it was on the appointed board. And I appreciate the opportunity to be here today to give to add my version to all the other versions that I've heard of what went on. But specifically, I represented Medina and Uvalde County for most of the time that I've been in the legislature, and several other counties, and the way it affected those counties. I think that the number one thing, in my view, that the Edwards Aquifer Authority or any district that would have been put in place of any sort has taught us is that we really can live with a lot less water than what we thought we needed. And the message there is that, you know, the long-term solution is water conservation, and I've always preached that. And I think that the Edwards, if it's done nothing else in these years, by the mandatory cutbacks, have shown people that you can live with a 40% reduction, and it doesn't destroy your economy and everything else, and it won't drive the development away from your town and those types of things. And the other thing that we've learned is that you really can farm on 2 acre-feet of water, and particularly if it rains. And that brings us to the third thing that we've learned is it don't always rain. When we designed those trigger levels for J17 and J27, the general thought process was that the western counties, and it was a different pool, so there really was no reason for them to ever be going into stage 4 or 5 because they really didn't have any influence on the spring flow anyway. They were just there for political considerations and because they had to be politically to get the bill passed. And so everybody, including Doug's folks and everybody, was very generous with the J27 trigger level that theoretically was never going to put us in any kind of serious drought. And lo and behold, it does quit raining north of Uvalde, And now we're in what stage are we in now? 4? 5, stage 5. And 44% reduction, I believe. And so, but the town goes on, and they grumble, and we're happy about it, but we've learned that you can conserve in that, and you never know what the future would bring. If you told us then, we would have bet every farm and ranch out there that we'd never make stage 5, and here we are. And it's not because we're using more water or anything like that. We use less water than we used then. It's just that you can't control what the good Lord does. So those are the 3 things.
One other question for the 3 of you, and then Russ has some questions as well. All 3 of you sit on the House Natural Resources Committee, been there more than 1 session, in the case of Tracy, several sessions. In terms of what you see from the Edwards situation, looking at other controversies that come before House Natural Resources or issues that are discussed at House Natural Resources, what lessons do you see being applied from the Edwards in other regions, or could be applied in other regions and other controversies of a water nature in other parts of the state? Lyle?
It created the first water market that we saw in the state. People were not accustomed to buying water rights, and the Edwards sort of set the template up, and other areas are following suit. Obviously, statutorily, they don't have the same empowerment that the Edwards Aquifer region has, but it still has the process in place of how you value water and create the mutual benefit approach to it, where if somebody puts a pivot irrigation system in and they're saving water, that they can get an additional revenue stream coming back to them, and it will help prop up the economies in the rural areas. It needs to be done and follow what Doug and the folks that were sitting on the Edwards, they made sure that they had a lot of science behind everything that they were doing, and the cause and the effects. I think that that's probably as much as of anything. Also the uniformity in the rules. I think that that's something that we're missing in a lot of the aquifer regions across the state. We've got a lot of single county districts that have been set up. There's no uniformity, and so there's inconsistency on how we've got a management plan in trying to preserve different aquifers across the state.
Okay. Doug?
Well, Ken, I would say that some of the things that come to mind in this is that, first off, I don't think there'll ever be another Edwards Aquifer Authority. I think it was a unique time. We had a federal judge involved, which, more than likely will never happen because of just all the circumstances. In fact, on my way up here, and I certainly was glad to hear the last panel, how they rewrote a lot of the stories, about what happened back then. As I recall, John, it all started right here in San Marcos one Sunday morning, wasn't that right? We all kind of started thinking about that, and John and Roger brought an idea to us and said, look, remember we talked about the underground stream? They'd filed, there was the issue, filed the lawsuit, lost that lawsuit, and that was kind of the start of where we headed down that thing. I still have my different opinion on that, but a lot of things that have happened or will happen in the future about water districts, where as a result, we made a decision, and I know we got Carol and we got a number of other board members that served with me. Early on, we started having an annual retreat and coming together and starting to, pound our swords into plowshares and thought, we've got an issue here that we need, that is beyond us, that's beyond our community, that's larger than us, that it's really about Texas. And so we made a decision that we would put ourselves at risk as elected officials, but we needed to be the preeminent water district in the state of Texas. We needed to be the model. Now, that cost a lot of money, made a lot of lawyers a lot of money, because of all the court cases that we had to go through. But I would think that some of the things, and I know that my colleagues on House Natural Resources, and Chairman Ritter would smile at me the last 3 sessions about comments that I had to make, but I think that what the Edwards Aquifer Authority, which is so unique, was able to accomplish by what was set up by Tracy and others that before us, that it really does set as an example. So as we go forward as a state, you know, the model here, whether it's water markets or whatever it is, there are maybe not exactly the same, but there are examples that can be drawn upon to help the management of water resources, especially groundwater resources in the state. And so, and all those lawsuits that happened, I see Darcy back there. You know, I mean, we had a lot of agony and debate and over those lawsuits, but out of each one has become the foundation, or has come the foundation of other either legislation or case law that people have relied on to move forward in implementing their district plans. So I do take 16 years on the Edwards board, 5 as chairman. I do take a lot of pride in that.
Okay. Tracy?
I think there's been some good lessons learned from the Edwards Aquifer Authority issue over the last 20 years. And I think one of those from groundwater management, and I've served on the Natural Resources Committee most of that time since then, is that there is a place for a permitting process that revolves around historical usage and historical rights. And there certainly is not a place for it. It's been tried to use in some places, tried to use it where, in my opinion, it probably wouldn't work very well. But there is a need, and there is a place for historical rights, but I think it's limited. And I think we've learned that from the Edwards Aquifer issue. I think we've also learned that, you know, when we did the Edwards Aquifer issue, we thought we did a bunch of science, and we did. You know, Frank Court was involved back then, and we had probably 12 to 24 different models runs done by the Texas Water Development Board, which all basically came back saying that this wouldn't do anything to preserve spring flow in a record drought. But it would prolong spring flow. I mean, it would prolong it, but it wouldn't obviously, if it quit raining, all the springs are gonna quit running eventually. But now we have so much more available to us. And so these groundwater districts understand the need for science more, and we have that, and that is an outcome of the Edwards Aquifer legislation, I believe. It also, I think one thing it taught us is, one of the reasons that the men and women that served on the board of the Edwards Aquifer Authority were able to do what I thought was a wonderful job of implementing a very controversial piece of legislation was because they learned early, and they had a general manager who wasn't everybody's best friend, but he was a good lawyer, and I think that we see the need to mitigate these issues instead of litigate them. And I remember when they first got started at the Edwards Aquifer, Greg Ellis told me, he said, we're not going to court. He said, we don't go to court. He said, we settle and we mitigate. And he said, there may be a few cases that go to court, but it's going to be a long time from now. And he was absolutely right. That was the Day and the Bragg, which still aren't reconciled. And I think there's some lessons that were learned in that. And of course, he had learned those lessons at the Subsidence District in Harris County and Galveston County already. And so I think that we learned that the right manager at the right place with the right board is able to avoid a tremendous amount of problems. And that was a classic example in Edwards Aquifer. We've seen some other groundwater districts that I've been involved in and others around the state where the manager you know, created as many problems as they had more than they helped. And just because of the wrong personality maybe. And so, and the other thing I think we've learned is that you have to be very, very careful about how you put the board of directors together and what areas they represent for several reasons. Number one, you want to be fair, you want it to be sustainable, and number two, you want to avoid all these lawsuits that come along. Because every groundwater district in the state is subject to some kind of voting rights lawsuit, or at least not every groundwater district, but every special use district. And so I think you have to be very, very careful about the construction of the way the board is put together. And we learned that from the Edwards also.
Ken, can I make one comment about, Tracy's exactly right about Greg Ellis. he was the right guy. Chuck Bailey, who was here, it was kind of Chuck and Greg and of course Chuck, because of his position in helping develop the legislation. But Greg had just another part of that, was that Greg's philosophy was that we were going to avoid litigation, as Tracy said, but we were waiting. If there was going to be a litigation, we wanted to pick the case we could win, the best chance to win. You know what I'm saying? Is because we want to set an example. And he had also received that from working in the Harris-Galveston Subsidence District. That's the way they were able to manage down there. They won a few key cases, and then everybody else said, uncle. And so it's kind of like when you're out hunting, whitetail hunting, you got a lot of 8-pointers that are coming by, but you're really waiting for that 15-pointer. We were waiting for the 15-pointers, and we had some of those. The day case, maybe not, but we had some of those, okay? We decided, I guess it got late in the season, and we needed to take one. But you're right, Tracy.
Okay, gentlemen, let's talk a little bit about something that we haven't talked about much today, and that we've talked a lot about the water management side of this equation and the different interest groups, but what we didn't focus on was the governing board, the makeup of the governing board. And I like to say, one of the challenges for the Edwards Aquifer Management was that we had roughly a third of the water use dedicated to the irrigated agriculture community, about a third of the water use dedicated to municipal use, largely in Bexar County, and then about a third of the water either spring flow or New Braunfels and San Marcos dependent. So you have this, kind of equal involvement and interest in the resource, but you have widely different population. Bexar County has more than 1 million people. Uvalde and Medina County together have less than, 100,000, 150,000?
Less than 100.
So the solution in '95 was a board that had 4 members from the irrigation community, 7 members from Bexar County, and 4 members from the spring community. And the idea there was that San Antonio would not have majority control of the board. There's litigation that currently threatens that makeup. What's your view, each of you? What's your view about the importance of the makeup of that board and the representation of those interests?
Well, by the way, I on my notes, I wanted to say that the western counties, of course, most of the water was being always pumped by the irrigation community, but people forget that there's a number of small communities out there that rely on the Edwards Aquifer exclusively for their water. So when you're the state rep of that area, you've got a handful of people that are pumping most of the water that are certainly constituents, and then you've got the vast majority of the people that are voting for your reelection that that are in these small cities that are facing a 44% reduction. So and they get lost in the discussion a lot of times, and so it's not just a handful of farmers that are driving the train when we make our decisions in the western counties. But to your question, I think that the original board was appointed, then the next board was this board that we've got. I always thought it was if you had to have the Edwards Aquifer Authority, and of course, in my part of the world, it was overwhelmingly opposed when it was passed. But if you had to have it, that board makeup was probably as good as you could get. In our view, it was, and I certainly think in the view of the entire region, it is. And there's a voting rights lawsuit going on right now, and if it is carried and it's being, we're told, being bankrolled by the city of San Antonio, and if it is carried to its ultimate degree, well, it basically would mean that Doug's folks in the east might get 1 representative, and we might get 1 representative if they're generous in the west, and all the rest of them be in San Antonio. And to the extent that they could agree with one another, they could obviously control the district, but even they could have some dissenters and still control it. And that would take away from the whole premise that that thing was originally designed for and pushed for, ironically the hardest, by the powers that be in San Antonio. And so I think it's a very, very dangerous ground that we're on here, personally.
All right, I'll take a shot at it. The way that this was set up in 1477, as I recall, was that it was following the example of the Harris-Galveston Subsidence District. It was an appointed board, and so, you know, there was, as Lyle may remember when he was on city council, or I think he had not been a county commissioner yet, but there were people that were serving on the old Edwards Underground Water District Board that maybe weren't in sync with the business community and the chamber and people like that. And of course, another part of this is that because of some legislation that happened in either the 89 session or the 87 session, was that Uvalde was giving, and Medina were giving, all counties were given the ability to pull out. Medina and Uvalde did. They took a vote of the people and pulled out. So really the Edwards Underground Water District, when all this went on, was only Bexar County, Comal County, and Hayes County. There were only 3 counties in there. And as I recall, there were, I think, 6, Russ, you helped me, 6 in Bexar County, 3 in Comal County, and 3 in Hayes County. And but the setup was an elected board by those 3 counties, and where the water came from out in the west, you know, we didn't have any control or input into. So we had a dysfunctional situation going into this. Of course, you know, when we came up with this idea of an appointed board, everybody said, hey, you do it down in Harris County, and why wouldn't it work here? And then, so after the voting rights lawsuit, and you know, we got past that, went back, and like I said, I can't remember the exact number, HB 3259 or 57 or something like that. Those numbers run together on me, but it was a bill, and I believe that Chairman Puente was the author of that bill.
That is correct.
And he was not chairman at that particular time, but he was a member of House Natural Resources. And he authored that bill, and I remember all the negotiations and the discussions about that bill and trying to get the right mixture. And as Tracy has said, it came up, and you can't believe all the different combinations that were thrown out there. We had one member that was supposed to represent like 17 counties downstream or something like that. I mean, it was really crazy, but came up with what I thought was a pretty good, and a lot of us thought was a pretty good compromise. And in fact, Maldev, as I recall, was in on the negotiations. When we finally came down to it, they helped draw the districts. And so the litigation that we have today by them was over the fact that they're the ones that set this up in this. And I'll give you the example, perfect example. The largest and the smallest population districts are not in San Antonio or out in the west. They're in Comal County. You know, we've got one district that's all inside the city limits in New Braunfels. It's got about 9,000 people live in it, or it did when it was created. And my district, which was a combination of Comal and Guadalupe County, had 172,000 people. Now, if they had a problem with one man, one vote, why didn't they have it back then? That's my question. Here we are. We've gone through 20 years of developing, and we've heard, I would say testimony. We have heard people say today that it works, that it is the example. That we would base decisions about other districts. So what did we do wrong? What did the Edwards do wrong? I guess they didn't do anything wrong till I left as chairman. Then it all went downhill after that.
Amen, brother. Amen.
But that, I guess that's kind of my point. And if we have a scenario, and you know, Robert Puente and I have had this discussion over breakfast. We got a scenario where we go one man, one vote at best, and we keep a 15-member board. It's 13 members from Bexar County, 1 member that would represent all the east. That would be 4 counties: Comal, Guadalupe, Caldwell, and Hayes. And then out in the west, it would be Atascosa, Medina, and Uvalde County. They'd have 1. Now, 13 to 1, and what I was told in some discussions is, look, we don't need all the votes. We just want to have, 10 or 11, just so we don't get caught up with that number 8. Well, let me tell you what, I served with those people in Bexar County. The Bexar County delegation could never get together and come to an agreement on anything. And I think that's what made some people upset about the fact that the decisions we were making when I was on the board were not favorable every time to the Bexar County constituents or to SAWS. And I remember Mike Thus walking away from some board meetings and Mike was the general manager of SAWS at the time, being pretty frustrated with some of the things because Susan Hughes and some of the other people did not vote the way that SAWS wanted them to. They were independent thinkers. They were elected by a constituency and there to represent what they thought was the best thing. So I'm confused, I guess, is the best thing to say is, why are we trying to back up and go to a scenario that nobody really wanted back in 1995 when Robert Puente passed that bill?
I think you've heard two contrasting views there. I was tasked in 1993 to go out to Medina County and meet with a guy named Maurice Remkes and Danny McFadden. And they're two icons in the Edwards region on the western side. The prohibition was put in because something one of my colleagues on city council said kiddingly that Maurice took an exception to, and we built a prohibition of moving any water past the Canipa Gap into San Antonio, or building a pipeline. And the whole idea, and I agree with both of their viewpoints, was coexistence. You've got differing uses of the water. You've got the ag use, and you've got the municipal use and industrial use, and then you got the downstream purposes of the water for the environmental flows and for the economies and on recreation side of it. So I think it's worked well. You know, it hasn't been perfect, but I think to change it now, you're going to see lines drawn in the sand again. And I think that's what happened at the inception of 1477. We ran west. We realized that there was a lot of water out there that we could align ourselves, and that would be 2/3 of the interest against Armbruster and the folks to the east. And so there were different alliances. Those alliances broke down, and I think logic prevailed. You know, we made some decisions. Some litigation forced us into curtailments, and I think that it's worked pretty well. And I'd hate to see it break down to where you have the 800-pound gorilla. That's how we're characterized ever since 1993, if you represent any or part of San Antonio. But I think we've done a pretty good job working with all of the parties that are interested, and now we've gone out and hopefully we'll give lifelines to folks in San Marcos and New Braunfels in the long term as we build infrastructure to bring water into the region. And this is 2 and 3 generations from now. But looking forward, I think that without the anchor of San Antonio and the resources, you know, you're going to continue to see so much compression on the resource that we probably couldn't exist at all. You know, we'd have too much mining going on in the aquifer. So I like it how it is. I agree with Doug, and I agree with Tracy. Why break something that's not broke?
You're exactly right. And Mike Belden was a great chairman because he saw the interests of everybody. The fact that he was I heard somebody mention the scenario and the people and the dynamic that was put together. Mike Belden was the perfect first chairman because he took everybody's interest. He didn't play the 800-pound gorilla.
Right.
He took everybody, and that's why Mike has continued to be the senior water advisor for mayor after mayor in San Antonio. And so we're very fortunate to have somebody like that had that overarching perspective.
Okay, I have another quick question. It was alluded to earlier, gentlemen, but one of the things that has made the Edwards Aquifer Authority a success, I believe, is the fact that there is a market for water in the Edwards region, that those that are short of water can participate in that market to acquire additional water resources, and those that have more water than they currently need have the opportunity to benefit from conservation or water reduction. Is that something that we should take to heart in looking at how to solve the state's water problems in other parts of the state? Is this lesson that we have learned in the Edwards?
You have to remember that the water market in Edwards, the water never actually leaves, because you're not exporting water. You're just selling a piece of paper that says you can pump more water out of your well. So that's a very, very different creature than water exports. When you export water out of a rural community and potentially create a shortage there to alleviate a shortage in an urban area just because that's where the money is, that's a very different set of politics. And so I don't think that you've learned anything from the Edwards Aquifer in terms of those types of scenarios. Now, in the areas where you have an aquifer that flows and recharges like this one, and I don't know where that is, then you can set up a similar permitting system that's worked pretty well. You know, it was said earlier that the pipeline prohibition was against the best interest, but actually, if you could go out and drill a pipeline, nobody really benefits from that except the people that are pumping the water. But with the pipeline prohibition, everybody that could put a permit had ability to sell a water right, a piece of paper, and they got very, very wealthy on that. A number of them did. And if you'd just been ability to pipe that water out of there, they would have gone to the nearest source, they would have bought their 4 acres, and they would have piped it. And so unless you had some kind of scenario where everybody that had a permit, could also sell, but with the understanding it was being pumped over there and not pumped over here, and you can do that. And there's ways you can do that too. But I just don't think that I think it's apples and oranges when you compare the way that water markets work with the Edwards with the typical scenario that you're seeing with San Antonio and Burleson County or some of the other myriad of ones that people want to do in the Carrizo.
Well, and I agree with Tracy completely. I will tell you, this is why I don't think it would be the same anywhere else, is you don't have a cap. The uniqueness of the Edwards is that you have a cap. And it was set arbitrarily, then it was adjusted, and then, and now you've got oversight from U.S. Fish and Wildlife. So all of that works together to make it work. But without the cap, I think your water market, even though people have a tendency to sell, there are going to be other issues that arise out of that sale of the water. And I think the future legislatures, hopefully I may be gone by that time, will have to deal with that situation because it's going to create water shortages in other areas and for other river basins.
Well, I think that the crop share program that we've seen materialize out west of San Antonio, where people have put in over $40 million worth of pivot irrigation systems since the passage of 1477, they've saved over 50% of the water. They're getting the same yield using half of the water, and then the other water comes to the population center. That's a pretty good model, to be candid with you. That's what they're doing in a drought-stricken California, where you've got the Imperial and the San Joaquin Valley. They trade water between the ag use and then the population centers that need it. And you stress conservation. The people that are conserving the most water, they're going to benefit financially. And the folks that Tracy was talking about, there's some very large irrigating farm interest in Uvalde and Medina County that control a lion's share of it. They're the ones that have put their own money up to save a lot of water, and that water is being conveyed to San Antonio through permits. And so I think it's a great model, for the balance of the state, that if you're going to create an issue and you have science to control it, you don't have a cap. And I agree with Doug, what he's saying, but if we're going to use science as the arbiter of whether we're going to transport water into areas that are growing, and we use the efficiency of technology to save the water, you're going to use the water, whether you throw it on the ground to irrigate or you transport it out. There's a balancing act there. And I think the Edwards has done it, at least in the areas that I've seen in Medina and Uvalde County. They've done a pretty good job. And they are a model for the balance of the state.
And I agree with what Lyle's saying. It has been a great model in those areas, but the average person on the street thinks that water's leaving. And that's the difference, is in areas where the water stays in place, this model is, you know, you can use this model. But I just don't think, in my personal opinion, that you can extrapolate that model over to a place where you're actually exporting water. It's a completely different beast then.
Science.
I had a question for each of you that doesn't deal entirely exclusively or directly with the Edwards in some respects, but in 2011, the legislature enacted Senate Bill 332, which said that groundwater ownership is a right in place. And in 2013, we had the Day decision. We still have the Bragg case out there, I guess, without a final decision. You know, these things are continually debated, and probably will be long after we're gone. But do you foresee anything in this legislative session or perhaps a subsequent session that will address again the groundwater management and or ownership issues as the drought situation continues in many parts of the state on an ongoing basis? Tracy?
I haven't been brought anything, I mean, right now.
Doug?
Well, you know, it's a situation where I think we're going to continue water, and I think my colleagues can attest to this, is it used to be a situation that you were just on natural resources, and it was a committee out there. Yeah, it was important, but it wasn't as important. Last session, the #1 requested committee was natural resources. Over half the members asked to be on that committee. Now there's only, what is there, 11 of us or something like that? So, you know, it's pretty hard to get onto. And I hear a lot of freshmen that I've talked to, and even people in their second term, you know, want to get on natural resources. Water has become the issue that is driving that economic engine here. The other part of that equation is the conservative nature of the legislature. And I think that I really don't know if there's going to be anything except for maybe more toward the scenario of SB 332. It was interesting in SB 332, of course, it was the Wildlife Association, and this is what I recall, Wildlife Association, cattle raisers, and the Farm Bureau that was on the issue. And the Farm Bureau had passed a resolution at their annual convention in December that said that they wanted to protect their members' water that they were using for their own domestic and livestock purposes. But it appeared to me, and I probably was one that caused some of the agony and pain as we went through that, was that there were a number of people out there that wanted to use SB 332 so they could replicate the situation that Tracy just talked about, where people in Valley and Medina County made millions off of water, sometimes at the detriment of their neighbors. So I think that there may be, I don't know anything. I know that I think maybe Lyle has been more involved than I have. I've been monitoring. There's been a whole stakeholder group meeting. I think, Ken, y'all have been involved in that. So I don't think there's going to be a session going forward with the growth that we're having in Texas and the Texas miracle, or whatever you want to call it, that something about water and how we manage it is not going to happen, whether it's an SB 332 or an accentuation of that or a change in that. I don't know at this point, but I know that groundwater in particular is going to continue to be one of those forefront issues that the Texas legislature is going to have to address long after I'm gone from it.
We have to do something. We had compression on the resource in 2011, and we have not recovered. And in the vast part of the state, if you look at unprecedented depletions in groundwater and surface water, we haven't got our surface water inventories back in shape to handle the population surge that we're experiencing. You've got a lot of communities looking at transport projects across the state right now, moving water from areas where you have the science that shows you've got a lot of water in certain aquifers. They replenish after the growing seasons. And 332 ostensibly was an enabler to move some of the water. If you owned large tract of land, you had the water right through a groundwater conservation district or an unrestricted area of the state, that you could move that water into the population center. One thing that we do see is when you start talking about water, everybody pulls their sword out, and it creates a lot of blood on the floor. And I think that what we saw in the Edwards, it's a great template for how we can balance the needs, and that we stress conservation, that we don't overuse the resource, and that we built parameters into contracts that if communities are going to be asking to transport water into their area, that they have the best conservation plan before we start taking water into those communities. Scarcity is going to make the legislature react, and the regulatory scheme right now in a lot of people's minds is not conducive to moving water. And the reason being is a lot of times decisions are not made by science, they're made with political decisions. And the political decisions are usurping the private property right of the folks that own property that would like to transport that water out. And so we are going to come, and we're at the brink of making some, we're going to have to make some changes if we're going to move water. San Angelo at the end of 2011 had 13 months of water supply left. 2 of their lakes completely dried up. O.H. Ivy had about 16% of its capacity. And so when they're looking at moving water from Fort Stockton or they're moving it from the Hickory Aquifer and having a stopgap measure till they can get a more sustainable source, we better protect that community. It's 100,000 people with several Fortune 500 companies heavily invested into it. And if we don't protect that, it sends a message all over the world that San Angelo ran out of water. That's indicative of what Texas is. The economic sustainability of this state is going to be predicated on our ability to handle the water needs that we've got in communities, big and small, across the state. And from the state's perspective, we can't stand in the way from that happening. We've got to make sure that communities have water. We're all Texans. I went to East Texas, and I went to a conference in Stephen F. Austin, and the folks in East Texas, they don't want their water moved. You know, anytime anybody moves in from Central or South Texas and we're over there talking to them, it's like, what are you doing? You quit sniffing our water. You know, we don't want you over here. And when I first started talking to them, I said, how many of y'all are Texans? Everybody in the room raised their hand. I figured there'd be somebody from Louisiana or Oklahoma, but they're all Texans. And about halfway through the discussion about transporting water out, I said, we're all Texans. We spent $1.3 billion fixing the aftermath of a hurricane in East Texas. We're all Texans. We're gonna fix it. We're gonna work it. We're gonna spend Texas resources for that. But when it comes to water, we're not Texans. We're regional. You know, I'm a regional Texan at that point. I'm in East Texas, and I don't want my water. And I think we better look at this as a group, just like the Edwards has. I mean, when that legislation passed, all of us had swords out, and we were cutting each other up. I'll be damned, I'm gonna let San Antonio suck all that water out. You know, and the folks on the west end, the east of us, the folks on the east saying, you're gonna dry our economy up. I don't think a lot of them are really worried about the fountain daughter. I think maybe just one. But the rest of us had to live with the consequences of that fountain daughter. But the rest of it was just, we were fighting. We had swords out. And we've got to fix this. And in some ways, the state's going to have to lead. Because from a local standpoint, we're going to it's a Friday night football mentality. We're going to hate on each other. You're not going to get my water, you know, because of that mentality. So we got to do something, and I think that Doug Doug is right. I don't know if it's done now or it's done next session or following session. Scarcity is going to make all those decisions for us.
Okay, well, I want to thank all three of you. I think it should be readily apparent to the crowd that we have three very thoughtful, experienced folks serving on the House Natural Resource Committee this session. And I want to thank the Geography Department and the folks that made this program happen. Todd, do you have any final comments?
I do. Just a couple of final comments. Thanks again to Representative Miller and King and Larson and our two moderators who did a great job. I might remember that in the future. You might be doing that again. And I would also like to thank President Trouth and Texas State for hosting the forum today, as well as all of you for coming and staying for almost 8 hours and listening to talks about the Edwards Aquifer. You must really love the Edwards Aquifer, is all I can say, the way I do, of course. And finally, thanks to the Texas State Geography Department. They really did a fantastic job, from Dr. Giordano and Dr. Hagelman and all the student workers and staff. The video today will be on the Texas Water Journal website, but it might be a while. You know, we're a voluntary organization, so we'll see how long it takes to get it on there, but it will be there eventually. And maybe the Geography Department will have it as well. So you can relive every moment of this. If you really want to, you can. Fast forward parts of it, maybe. I don't know. Thanks again, and drive
One
home
last
safely.
comment.
Oh, well, of course.
From an alumnus of this university, this fine institution, I have to say, go Bobcats.
Yeah, okay, all right. That's a good way to end it.